The man stood on the gallows with a black hood over his head and a rope around his neck. It was early morning in the small Texas town of Dusty Creek, and the sky above the square had turned the color of a fresh bruise. Dark clouds churned on the western horizon, promising rain, promising violence. The air was thick with the smell of dust and anticipation, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the drums of war. A crowd had gathered to watch the hanging. Men in worn hats and women in faded dresses stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale and eager in the gray light. They had come to see justice done. They had come to see a man die. Sheriff Daniel Crawford stood at the base of the wooden platform, a piece of paper in his hands. He was a tall man, lean as a whip, with a drooping mustache the color of salt and pepper, and eyes as sharp as broken glass. He read from the paper in a voice that carried across the silent square. Caleb Mercer, for the crimes of robbery and murder, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul. The condemned man did not struggle. He did not cry out or beg for his life. He simply stood there, his hands bound behind his back, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. The black hood hid his face, but it could not hide the quiet dignity with which he faced his end. The hangman placed his hand on the lever. The crowd held its breath. And then the condemned man spoke. His voice came from beneath the hood, calm and clear, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade through silk. "She taught me to live clean," he said. "I would die for her." No one understood what he meant. No one except one person in the crowd. A woman stood at the edge of the square, half hidden behind a stack of wooden crates near the blacksmith shop. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face and a long coat that concealed what she carried beneath it. Her name was Emma Thornton, and 3 weeks ago she had been a lonely widow on a failing ranch with nothing to live for and no one to love. Everything had changed since then. The hangman tightened his grip on the lever. Emma raised the pistol. The gunshot split the morning like a crack of lightning, sharp and sudden and impossibly loud. The rope above Caleb's head exploded in a spray of frayed hemp, severed clean through by a bullet fired from 50 feet away. For a single heartbeat, nothing moved. The crowd stood frozen, their mouths hanging open, their eyes wide with shock. The hangman stared at his empty hand, at the useless lever, at the condemned man who was suddenly free of his noose. Then chaos erupted. Caleb tore the black hood from his head, his pale gray eyes blazing as they swept across the square. He found her instantly, the woman with the smoking pistol in her hand, the woman who had just defied the law and 100 witnesses to save his life. "Run!" Emma screamed. He did not need to be told twice. Caleb leaped from the gallows platform, his bound hands making the landing awkward and painful. He hit the muddy ground hard, a grunt of pain escaping his lips, but he was already moving, already running toward her with everything he had. Emma had prepared for this moment. A horse waited behind the blacksmith shop, saddled and ready. She fired another shot into the air, scattering the crowd, buying them precious seconds of confusion. Caleb reached her. She shoved the reins into his bound hands and swung up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "Go," she shouted. "Go now." He spurred the horse, and the animal lunged forward, plowing through the panicked crowd and racing toward the edge of town. Behind them, men were shouting, grabbing for their guns, organizing a pursuit. But they had a head start. A few seconds, maybe a minute at most. It would have to be enough. The horse thundered down the main street and out through the town gates, carrying them away from the gallows, away from the law, away from everything Emma had ever known. The sky above them darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. This is how it ended. But to understand how they got here, we need to go back. 3 weeks earlier. The sky over the Texas plains stretched gray and heavy, vast and empty, taut from one horizon to the other. Below it, the land offered no comfort to the eye. Just an endless sweep of brown grass and stubborn rock, baked hard by months of relentless sun, with not a tree or a building in sight for miles in any direction. This was Emma Thornton's world, a world measured in fence posts and the ache in her bones. She stood at the gate of her ranch, her hands wrapped around a heavy wooden beam, straining to lift it back into place. The wind whipped strands of faded blonde hair across her face, and she squinted against the dust that swirled around her like the ghosts of better times. Emma was 28 years old, but the life she had lived made her look older. Her face was thin and weathered, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had been burned brown by the sun. Her eyes were the color of the sky before a storm, a pale grayish blue that could turn cold as ice when she needed them to. Her hands were a map of hardship, the skin cracked and calloused, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt that never fully washed away. She wore a cotton dress that had once been blue but had faded to a grayish white from too many washings. It was patched in several places at the elbows and along the hem, and it hung loosely on her thin frame. Her boots were old leather scuffed and worn, the most valuable thing she owned besides the land itself. The Thornton Ranch lay spread out behind her, a collection of buildings that had seen better days. A small wooden cabin with a sagging porch, a barn with a roof that leaked when it rained, a chicken coop that was half falling apart, and fences, miles of fences, that seemed to be rotting faster than she could repair them. 20 head of cattle grazed in the sparse pasture, thin and sickly looking, their ribs visible through their hides. They were all that remained of a herd that had once numbered over 100. The rest had been lost to disease, to drought, to theft, to the slow grinding destruction of a world that did not care whether Emma Thornton lived or died. She had been alone here for 2 years now. 2 years since they buried William on the little rise behind the cabin in a grave marked by a simple wooden cross that she had carved herself. 2 years since she had woken in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed cold and empty, and had followed the sound of gunshots to find his body lying by the creek, blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The sheriff had called it a rustling gone wrong, said there was nothing to be done, said these things happened out here on the frontier, and a woman living alone should consider selling to someone who could protect the land properly. Emma had refused. She had refused when Henry Dawson came knocking 3 days after the funeral, offering to buy the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth. She had refused when the other ranchers tried to pressure her, cutting off her access to water, driving their cattle through her fences. She had refused when the whispers started in town, the pitying looks from the women, the hungry looks from the men who saw her as a piece of unclaimed property. She had refused, and she had kept refusing, and she would keep refusing until the day she died or the day the land finally broke her, whichever came first. It was not pride that kept her going, whatever people thought. It was something simpler and more desperate than that. The ranch was all she had left. If she gave it up, she would have nothing. She would be nothing, and Emma Thornton would rather die fighting than surrender to the nothing. But the fight was getting harder. The well was running low. The fences needed repair she could not afford. The cattle were too thin to sell and too few to survive another hard winter. She had maybe 3 months of supplies left, maybe less. When those ran out, she would have to make a choice she had been avoiding for 2 years. She tried not to think about it. Thinking about it made the darkness creep in, the darkness that lived in the corners of her mind, that whispered to her in the quiet hours of the night that none of it mattered, that she was just delaying the inevitable, that William was dead, and she might as well be too. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away, and focused on the gate. One task at a time. That was how you survived. You did not look at the mountain. You looked at the next step. The wind changed direction, and Emma paused, lifting her head to sniff the air. There was something different about it now. A heaviness, a dampness, and underneath it the faint metallic smell of rain. She turned to look at the western horizon, and her stomach clenched. The sky out there had changed. The gray had deepened to a churning black, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Inside that darkness she could see flickers of lightning, brief and bright, like the eyes of some enormous beast opening and closing in its sleep. A storm was coming. Not a gentle spring shower that would bless the parched earth with life-giving water. This was something else. This was a brawler of a storm, the kind that tore roofs off barns and flooded creeks and sent cattle stampeding in blind panic. Emma knew these storms. She had grown up with them, had learned to read the sky the way other people read books. and what she read now told her she had maybe an hour, maybe less, before hell came down on her ranch. "Come on," she muttered to herself, abandoning the gate and running toward the pasture where her cattle grazed. Come on, come on, come on. The cattle sensed it too. They had stopped grazing and stood with their heads raised, their eyes rolling white, their lowing turning anxious and high-pitched. The lone cottonwood tree at the edge of the pasture offered no shelter from what was coming. She had to get them into the small corral near the barn, the only structure on the ranch that might withstand the coming deluge. She grabbed a length of frayed rope and began swinging it at the nearest steer, shouting and cursing as she tried to drive the animals toward safety. They were stubborn beasts, too stupid to know she was trying to save their lives, and they scattered in every direction as she ran after them. The first raindrop hit her cheek like a thrown stone, cold and hard and heavy with menace. Then another, and another. And then the sky opened up, and a solid wall of water came crashing down. Emma had never experienced anything like it. The rain did not fall so much as it attacked, driving sideways in blinding sheets, soaking through her thin dress in seconds and plastering it to her skin like a second layer of flesh. The wind rose to a shriek, tearing at her hair, pushing her off balance, trying to drive her to her knees. She could not see. She could barely breathe. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of gray water and howling sound, and somewhere in that chaos her cattle were running, scattering, vanishing into the storm. Thunder exploded overhead so close that she felt it in her chest, felt it vibrate through her bones. Lightning forked across the sky, turning night into day for a single blinding instant, and in that instant she saw them, her cattle running in every direction, already too far gone to save. She had lost them. Emma stood in the driving rainwater streaming down her face and felt something inside her crack. 2 years of fighting, 2 years of refusing to give up, and now this. The storm would take what little she had left, and come morning she would have nothing. Nothing but an empty ranch and an empty future, and the darkness whispering that she should have let go a long time ago. She turned toward the barn, meaning to take shelter to wait out the storm and pray that some of her animals would survive the night. The mud sucked at her boots with every step, thick and greedy, trying to pull her down into the earth. And that was when she saw it. Through the blur of rain streaming down her face, she glimpsed a dark shape slumped against the lowest wire of her fence. A heap of wet cloth and despair that did not belong. Her first thought was that it was a dead calf, another loss to add to her tally. But as she drew closer, fighting against the wind, the shape resolved itself into something else entirely. It was a man. He lay face down in the mud, one arm flung out, as if reaching for something that was no longer there. His clothes were dark with water plastered to a body that was clearly too still, too quiet. He looked like a bundle of rags that someone had discarded by her fence, left there to rot. Emma stopped, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. A man. Out here, in this storm. No good could come of it. Every instinct she had, every lesson that 2 years of lonely survival had taught her, screamed at her to turn back. To run to her cabin and bar the door and pretend she had never seen him. This was not her trouble. The world had given her enough of her own. She took a step backward, and then she saw the stain spreading in the mud around his side. A dark stain too dark to be just rainwater. Even in the dim light of the storm she recognized it. Blood. He was hurt. He was hurt badly. Emma stood frozen, the rain pounding against her back, the wind howling in her ears. She knew what the smart thing was. She knew what the safe thing was. This man could be anyone, a criminal, a murderer, someone whose troubles would become her troubles if she got involved. But she could not move. She kept seeing William lying by the creek with his blood soaking into the dust. She kept seeing the way his eyes had stared at nothing, the way his hand had been reaching toward something someone helped that never came. She had not been there when William died. She had not been there to save him. Maybe that was why she stepped forward instead of back. Maybe that was why she knelt in the mud beside this stranger, this unknown man who had somehow found his way to her fence. Maybe some part of her was still trying to save William, even though William had been beyond saving for 2 years now. She reached out and touched his shoulder, shaking him gently. Nothing. She shook harder. A groan escaped his lips, low and guttural, a sound of pure agony. He was alive. Barely, but alive. That single sound sealed her fate. "Damn you," Emma whispered, though whether she was talking to him or to herself or to God she could not have said. "Damn you for being here." She grabbed the collar of his wet shirt and pulled. He was heavy, far heavier than she had expected, a dead weight of muscle and bone that her exhausted body was utterly unprepared for. She grunted with the effort, her boots sliding in the mud, her muscles screaming in protest. She pulled anyway. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him away from the fence, leaving 2 deep furrows in the mud where his boots scraped along the ground. The rain hammered down on them, relentless and unforgiving, and the wind tried to push her back with every step she took. She fell twice. The first time her face hit the mud, and she came up spitting dirt, her eyes burning. The second time her knee twisted, and a bolt of pain shot up her leg that made her cry out loud. Both times she got back up. The barn had never seemed so far away. In the darkness of the storm, with the wind screaming and the lightning flashing, it might as well have been on the other side of the world. But Emma kept going one step at a time because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant dying, and she was not ready to die just yet. When she finally dragged the man through the barn door, her strength was gone, completely and utterly spent. She collapsed beside him on the damp straw, her chest heaving, her lungs burning, the world spinning around her like she was drunk. For a long moment she just lay there, listening to the rain hammering on the tin roof, a deafening drumbeat that seemed to echo the frantic pounding of her own heart. She had done it. She had gotten him inside. Now came the hard part. Emma pushed herself up on trembling arms and looked at the man she had saved. In the darkness of the barn, with only the occasional flash of lightning to see by, he was little more than a shape, a collection of shadows that might have been human. She found a lantern hanging from a beam and lit it with shaking hands. The flame sputtered to life, casting a small circle of golden light that pushed back the darkness just enough to let her see. He was younger than she had thought. Maybe 29 or 30, with a face that was all sharp angles and hollows, like something carved from stone by an impatient sculptor. A few days' worth of dark stubble covered his jaw, and his black hair was plastered to his forehead, thick with mud and rain. But it was his eyes that caught her when they suddenly fluttered open. They were a pale gray, the color of winter clouds, the color of the sky before a storm. And in those eyes she saw something that made the hair on her arms stand up. Wildness, danger, the look of a cornered animal that would fight to the death if it had to. This was not a helpless traveler who had lost his way. This was something else, something dangerous. Emma's hand moved instinctively toward the pitchfork leaning against the wall. "Easy," she said, keeping her voice low and calm the way you would speak to a spooked horse. "Easy now." His eyes tracked her movement, sharp and aware, despite the pain that twisted his features. He tried to speak, but only a ragged cough came out. "You are hurt," Emma said. "Let me look at the wound." She found it easily enough, a ragged tear in his side high up near his ribs. His shirt was soaked with blood, the fabric fused to the wound by the drying gore. When she peeled it back as gently as she could, he hissed through clenched teeth, but he did not cry out. Emma's stomach clenched when she saw what lay beneath. It was not a wound from a fall or an accident. It was not a wound from an animal attack. She had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize what she was looking at. A gunshot wound. The bullet had gone in one side and out the other, leaving a puckered, angry hole that was still seeping blood. This man had been shot, recently, and whoever had shot him had meant for him to die. Emma sat back on her heels, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her. His gray eyes narrowed with suspicion and pain. For a long moment he did not answer. Then, in a voice like gravel scraping over stone, he said a single word. "Caleb." "Caleb what?" Another pause. Another moment of calculation behind those storm-colored eyes. "Mercer. Caleb Mercer." Emma nodded slowly, filing the name away. "Well, Caleb Mercer." It seems you have brought your trouble to my doorstep." "You should have left me," he rasped, trying to push himself up on one elbow and falling back with a sharp intake of breath. "Out there. You should have left me to die." "Maybe I should have," Emma said, her tone as flat and cold as the rain-soaked prairie. "But I did not. So now you are my problem." She stood up and moved to the rain barrel outside the barn door, filling a bucket with clean water. When she came back, she tore strips from an old grain sack and began cleaning his wound with brisk, efficient movements. He watched her the entire time, his pale eyes tracking her every move, filled with a mixture of suspicion and pain. He did not flinch when she touched the wound. He did not cry out when she packed it with clean cloth. He just watched, silent and still like a wolf, waiting for the right moment to bite. "There are men," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They will be looking for me." Emma paused, the bandage half wrapped around his torso. "What men?" "Bad men. Worse than you can imagine." He met her eyes, and in that moment she saw something beneath the wildness, something that might have been fear. "You should not have brought me here. They will come, and when they do, they will not care that you are just a woman trying to survive. They will burn this place to the ground." Emma finished wrapping the bandage and sat back, her face unreadable. "There is no one looking for anyone in this storm," she said. "You will stay here tonight. In the morning you will be on your way." She stood up and walked toward the barn door, meaning to return to her cabin, but his voice stopped her. "What is your name?" She looked back at him, at this stranger who had crashed into her life like a bolt of lightning. He lay on the straw, broken and bleeding, but his eyes were still sharp, still watching. "Emma," she said. "Emma Thornton." And then she stepped out into the rain, leaving him alone in the flickering lamplight. That night Emma did not sleep. She sat in the wooden chair before her fireplace, William's old rifle laid across her lap, her eyes fixed on the cabin door. The storm raged on outside, thunder rolling across the sky like the footsteps of giants, lightning turning night into day in brief blinding flashes. She thought about the man in her barn, Caleb Mercer. The name meant nothing to her, but the wound in his side told a story that she did not like. Men who got shot like that were either criminals or victims of criminals. Either way, trouble followed them like a hungry dog. And yet she had saved him. She could have left him in the mud. She could have let the storm take him, let him become another body that the land would swallow without a trace. No one would have known. No one would have blamed her. But she had not. She had dragged him to safety, had cleaned his wound and bandaged. It had given him shelter from the storm. Why? Because she could not stand to watch another person die on her land. Because she was lonely. So desperately lonely that even a dangerous stranger was better than the crushing silence of her empty life. She did not know. She was not sure she wanted to know. The hours crawled by, marked only by the slowly dying fire and the gradually softening rain. Around midnight, the worst of the storm seemed to pass, the thunder fading to a distant rumble, the lightning becoming less frequent. And then she heard it, a scream from the barn. Emma was on her feet before she knew she had moved, the rifle clutched in her hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. She grabbed an iron poker from the fireplace and ran out into the rain, her bare feet splashing through puddles, her nightgown soaking through in seconds. She burst through the barn doors expecting the worst, expecting to find him gone or dead or surrounded by the men he had warned her about. But he was alone. Caleb was thrashing on the straw, caught in the grip of a fevered nightmare. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold, and his hands clawed at the air, as if fighting enemies only he could see. His body twisted and writhed, and from his lips came sounds that were barely human, sounds of terror and anguish and bone-deep guilt. And names that Emma knew. "No," Caleb moaned, his voice thick with delirium. "Not the kid. Cole, no. Leave him be." Emma stood frozen in the doorway, the poker gripped tight in her hand. "Cole." "Garrett!" Caleb cried out, his body arching off the straw. "You bastard! The whole town! No!" Garrett. The names hit Emma like physical blows, one after another, driving the breath from her lungs. Cole Hardin. Garrett Wade. Everyone who lived in this part of Texas knew those names. They were spoken in hushed whispers and fearful glances over shoulders in the nervous way that travelers check their guns before setting out on long journeys. Cole Hardin and Garrett Wade, the leaders of the Black Ridge Gang. They were outlaws of the worst kind, robbers and murderers who had been terrorizing towns and ranches across the territory for the better part of a year. They hit stagecoaches and banks, killed sheriffs and witnesses, burned homesteads to the ground without a flicker of remorse. They were animals and human skin monsters who wore the faces of men, and the man lying in her barn had just spoken their names like he knew them personally. The truth crashed into Emma with the force of a physical blow. He had not been lying. He was not some innocent traveler who had been ambushed on the road. He was one of them, a member of the Black Ridge Gang, an outlaw, a criminal, possibly a murderer. She had not brought a common thief into her barn. She had sheltered a viper. Emma backed away slowly, her eyes wide with horror. The poker felt flimsy and useless in her hand. Everything in her screamed to run to get away from this man before his past came crashing down on her along with him. And yet, the kid, Caleb whimpered, his voice cracking. Just a kid. I could not. Cole, I could not do it. The words were not the words of a hardened killer boasting about his crimes. They were the words of a man being torn apart by his own memories, haunted by something he had done or refused to do. Emma stood in the doorway of the barn, rain dripping from her hair, watching the man who had stumbled into her life fight his demons in the darkness. She should run. She should call the sheriff. She should put a bullet in his head right now and solve the problem before it got any worse. But she did not move. Because beneath the terror of what she had just learned, beneath the very reasonable fear for her own safety, there was something else. A question that she could not ignore. What had he meant about the kid? The fever broke sometime before dawn. Emma sat on a bale of hay, a safe distance away, the rifle across her lap, watching as Caleb's thrashing gradually subsided. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed, and finally he lay still, looking less like a man fighting for his life and more like one who had simply given up. She should have killed him. Every practical bone in her body told her so. He was dangerous. He was a liability. The men who had shot him would come looking for him eventually, and when they did, they would not care about the innocent woman who had given him shelter. But something held her back. Maybe it was the way he had cried out in his sleep, not with the pride of a killer recounting his conquests, but with the anguish of someone tormented by what he had witnessed. Maybe it was the memory of William lying dead in the dust while his killers rode away unpunished. Maybe it was simply that she was tired, so tired of being alone in the world with no one to talk to and no one to fight for. Whatever the reason, Emma did not pull the trigger. When the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the barn walls, she stood up and walked to where he lay. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. The bandage around his ribs was stained with dried blood, but the bleeding seemed to have stopped. He would live. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, she had not yet decided. "I know what you are," she said quietly, even though she was not sure he could hear her. "I know what those names mean. Cole Hardin, Garrett Wade. You rode with the Black Ridge Gang." No response, just the slow rise and fall of his chest. "I should turn you in. There is a bounty on every member of that gang. Enough money to save this ranch 3 times over." She paused, her jaw tightening. "But I am not going to. Not yet." She crouched down beside him, studying his face in the pale morning light. Without the fever and the fear, he looked younger, almost innocent if you could ignore the scars on his knuckles and the hard lines around his mouth. "You are going to answer my questions," Emma said. "You are going to tell me the truth about who you are and why you are here, and then I will decide what to do with you." She stood up and walked to the barn door. "But first you are going to help me fix my ranch. You owe me that much for saving your miserable life." Outside, the storm had passed. The sun was rising over a world that had been scrubbed clean by the rain, a world that sparkled with false promise in the golden light. Emma looked out at her damaged fences, her scattered cattle, her ruined crops. The storm had taken a lot from her, but it had also brought her something. She was not sure yet whether that something was a blessing or a curse, but she intended to find out. The morning after the storm dawned gray and weeping, a thin mist hanging over the land like a burial shroud. Emma stood on her porch as the first weak light crept across the horizon, a cup of bitter coffee cooling in her hands, and surveyed the devastation that the night had left behind. It was worse than she had feared. A long section of the north fence had been ripped away completely, nothing left but splintered posts and tangled wire half buried in the mud. The chicken coop roof had been torn off, leaving the frightened birds huddled in what remained of their shelter. Shingles from the barn lay scattered across the yard like fallen leaves, and the vegetable garden she had worked so hard to maintain was now a flooded ruin of drowned plants and broken stakes. But the cattle were the worst loss. Of the 20 head she had fought to save, only 6 remained. They stood near the barn, shivering and miserable, their eyes rolling with lingering fear. The rest were gone, either scattered across miles of open prairie or drowned in the flash floods that had scoured the low-lying areas during the night. Emma stared at those 6 surviving animals and felt something crack inside her chest. 2 years of fighting, 2 years of refusing to give up. And in one night the storm had taken almost everything she had left. But she did not have time to mourn. She had a bigger problem waiting for her in the barn. She set down her coffee cup and walked across the muddy yard, her boots squelching with every step. The barn door creaked when she pushed it open, and pale morning light spilled across the hay-covered floor. Caleb Mercer was awake. He sat propped against a bale of hay, one hand pressed to his wounded side, his gray eyes sharp and alert despite the pallor of his skin. When he saw her, something flickered across his face. Wariness, calculation, the look of a man trying to figure out how much danger he was in. Emma stopped a few feet away from him, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression as hard as stone. "You talked in your sleep last night," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless, giving nothing away. "You called out names. Cole Hardin, Garrett Wade." Caleb's body went rigid. The wariness in his eyes sharpened into something closer to fear, though not fear of her. Fear of what she now knew. "You are one of them," Emma continued, taking a step closer. "You rode with the Black Ridge gang. You are an outlaw, a thief, maybe worse." The silence stretched between them thick and heavy as the morning mist outside. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Emma thought he might deny it, might try to spin some story that would explain away what she had heard. But he did not. "Yes," he said quietly. The word fell from his lips like a stone dropping into still water. "I rode with them. I was one of them." Emma felt her stomach clench, even though she had already known the answer. Hearing him admit it out loud made it real in a way that his fevered mutterings had not. "You are a killer," she said. "A murderer." "No." His voice gained a sliver of strength, and his pale eyes met hers with something that might have been defiance. "Not anymore. That is why I was shot. That is why I was left to die." "Explain." Caleb looked away, staring at the wall of the barn as if he could see through it to something far beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was different, older, heavier, like a man carrying a weight that had been crushing him for a very long time. "We hit a stagecoach station south of Willow Creek about a week ago. It was supposed to be easy, quick in, quick out, no complications." He paused, swallowing hard. "But there was a family there, a man, his wife, and their little boy. The kid could not have been more than 5 years old." Emma stood motionless, listening. "Cole does not like witnesses," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He told me to take care of the boy, to make sure he could not talk to anyone about what he had seen." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and raw. "The kid just stood there looking at me. He was not crying. He was not screaming. He just looked at me with these big eyes like he was waiting to see what I would do." Caleb's voice cracked. "And I could not do it. I looked at that boy, and I saw myself when I was that age after my father died, when I had no one left in the world, and I could not pull the trigger." He turned back to face her, and Emma saw something in his eyes that she had not expected. Not the cold emptiness of a killer, but the raw, bleeding wound of a man tormented by his own demons. I told Cole no. I turned my back on him, and Garrett shot me for it, put a bullet right through my side and left me for dead. Emma stood in silence, her mind reeling. She had expected a monster. She had expected excuses and justifications, the self-serving lies of a criminal caught in his own trap. What she had not expected was this: a man who had drawn a line in the sand, even if that line had come far too late. A man who had refused to kill a child and had nearly died for that refusal. It did not erase what he had done. It did not make him innocent, but it made him something other than the monster she had feared. "I should ride to the sheriff right now," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Tell him I have a wounded outlaw in my barn. There is a bounty on every member of that gang. Enough money to save this ranch 10 times over." "Then do it," Caleb said. His voice was weary, resigned, like a man who had already accepted his fate. "Maybe it is what I deserve." Emma looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since she had dragged him out of the storm. She saw the gaunt face and the fevered eyes. She saw the blood-stained bandage around his ribs. She saw a man who had done terrible things but had finally found a line he would not cross. And she saw something else too, something that surprised her, herself. She saw a person who had been pushed to the edge, who had been given every reason to give up, but who had kept fighting anyway. She saw a soul that was broken but not destroyed, damaged but not beyond repair. "You can barely stand," she heard herself say. "And I need someone to fix my fences, repair my roof, and help me find my scattered cattle. You stay here, you work for me until you are healed. After that, you go your own way. And if you try anything at all, I will put a bullet in you myself." Caleb stared at her, genuine surprise breaking through his carefully guarded expression. "You are not going to turn me in." "I have not decided yet," Emma said flatly. "But right now, you are more useful to me here than rotting in a jail cell. When I do not need you anymore, I will make my choice." She turned and walked out of the barn, leaving him sitting in the pale morning light. She did not know if she had just made the smartest decision of her life or the most foolish one, but she intended to find out. 30 miles to the west, in a canyon hidden from prying eyes, the Black Ridge gang had made camp. Cole Hardin sat by the fire, staring into the flames, with eyes as black and empty as the bottom of a well. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a beard as dark as coal and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who had forgotten to add any softness. He was 42 years old, and in those years he had killed more men than he could count. Some of them had deserved it. Most of them had not. Garrett Wade stood nearby, his right arm bound in a dirty sling. He was younger than Cole Leaner and meaner, with the quick eyes and nervous energy of a rattlesnake. The wound in his arm was a reminder of the fight that had happened a week ago when Caleb Mercer had tried to stop them and had nearly succeeded in putting a bullet through Garrett's skull before Garrett had returned the favor. "Any word?" Cole asked without looking up from the fire. Garrett shook his head. "Nothing yet, but he could not have gotten far, not with that hole in his side. He knows too much." Cole's voice was as cold and flat as frozen iron. "He knows about Willow Creek. He knows about what we did. If he talks to anyone, if he makes it to a sheriff or a marshal or anyone with a badge, we are finished. He will not talk. Caleb was always too soft for this life anyway. He is probably dead in a ditch somewhere, and we are worrying about nothing." Cole finally looked up, and the expression in his eyes made even Garrett take a step backward. "Find him," Cole said quietly. "Take as many men as you need. Search every farm, every ranch, every broken-down cabin between here and the border. And when you find him, make sure he does not talk to anyone, ever again." Garrett nodded quickly. "And if someone is sheltering him—" Cole turned back to the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light. "Then they burn with him." The days that followed settled into a strange and uneasy rhythm. Caleb began working as soon as he could stand. At first it was just small tasks, mending rope and sharpening tools, things he could do while sitting down. But as his strength returned, he took on harder work, digging fence post holes in the thick wet mud, hauling heavy cedar posts on his shoulders, stretching new wire until it hummed with tension. Emma watched him from a distance, still wary, still uncertain. She saw the way he threw himself into the work, the way he pushed through pain that would have stopped other men cold. He never complained, never asked for rest, never gave less than everything he had. It was as if he was trying to pay off a debt that could never truly be repaid. 1 week passed, and the fence along the north property line stood straighter and stronger than it had in years. The chicken coop had a new roof. The shingles on the barn had been replaced. Even the garden had been cleared of debris and replanted with new seeds. Emma found 3 more of her scattered cattle wandering in the hills to the east, bringing her total to 9. Still a devastating loss, but not the complete ruin she had feared. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, something began to change between them. It started with small things: a question about the cattle, an observation about the weather, a shared silence that was less awkward than it had been before. They were not friends, not by any stretch of imagination, but they were no longer complete strangers either. One evening, Emma brought Caleb's supper out to the barn, where he still slept, a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. He took it from her with a nod of thanks, but when he tried to lift the spoon to his mouth, his hand shook so badly that the liquid sloshed over the side. A flush of shame crept up his neck. He was a man who had spent his life being strong, being in control. This helplessness was a deeper wound than the hole in his side. Emma watched for a moment, then let out an impatient sigh. She sat down beside him, took the spoon from his trembling fingers, and lifted it to his lips. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The lamplight flickered around them, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. Outside, a gentle wind whispered through the grass. Then Caleb opened his mouth and let her feed him. They did not speak. Words would have ruined it, somehow would have made them acknowledge what was happening when neither of them was ready for that. Instead, they sat in silence, her hand lifting the spoon again and again, his eyes never leaving her face. When the bowl was empty, Emma stood up and turned to leave. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. She paused at the door but did not look back. "Do not make me regret this," she said. And then she was gone, leaving him alone with the lamplight and the strange, warm feeling that had settled in his chest. The next evening, Emma made a discovery. She was reading an old newspaper by the fire, using it to help start the kindling, when she noticed Caleb staring at the printed words with an expression of intense frustration on his face. His brow was furrowed, his jaw tight, and his eyes moved across the page without any recognition of what he was seeing. "You cannot read," she said. It was not a question. Caleb looked away, the same shame she had seen before coloring his features. "My father was a blacksmith in Kansas," he said quietly. "He taught me to hold a hammer before I could hold a pencil. He died when I was 12. After that, life did not give me many chances to learn." Emma considered this for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to the small shelf where she kept her few precious books. She pulled out an old leather-bound Bible, its pages yellowed with age, its spine cracked from years of use. "This belonged to my mother," she said, bringing it back to where he sat. "It is the only way I know how to teach." Caleb looked at the book, then at her. In his gray eyes, something shifted, a guard coming down just a little. "You would do that, teach me." "Someone should," Emma said. "A man ought to be able to read his own name at least." And so began the reading lessons. Night after night, by the flickering light of the fire, Emma sat beside Caleb with the Bible open between them. Her finger traced the words as she sounded them out, and he repeated them after her, his tongue stumbling over syllables that had been foreign to him his whole life. His progress was slow but steady. He had a quick mind, she discovered, beneath all that rough exterior. And there was something touching about the way he concentrated. His brow furrowed, his calloused fingers following hers across the page like a child learning to walk. In return, Caleb offered to teach her how to shoot properly. "A woman living alone out here needs to know how to defend herself." he said one afternoon, gesturing toward William's old rifle that still hung above the fireplace. "You can barely hit the broadside of a barn with that thing." "I can shoot well enough," Emma protested. "I watched you practice yesterday. You missed a target from 30 feet. That is not well enough." So they added shooting lessons to their routine. In the fading light of evening, they would go behind the barn where Caleb had set up a row of empty tin cans on the fence. He stood behind her, adjusting her stance, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he showed her how to aim. "Breathe in," he would murmur, his voice low in her ear. "Hold it. Line up the sights. Now breathe out halfway and squeeze." The first time she hit a can, she let out a whoop of triumph that surprised them both. Caleb laughed a real laugh, and for a moment the shadows that always seemed to lurk behind his eyes disappeared completely. "Good," he said, and there was pride in his voice. Again. These moments were dangerous, Emma knew. Every lesson, every shared silence, every accidental brush of hands was pulling them closer together. She could feel it happening, could feel the walls she had built around her heart starting to crack. But she could not seem to stop it, and she was not sure she wanted to. 2 weeks after the storm, the danger Emma had been dreading finally arrived. She was feeding the chickens in the morning when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Her heart seized in her chest. Visitors were rare at the Thornton Ranch, and when they came, they rarely brought good news. She shaded her eyes against the sun and watched as a single rider approached. As he drew closer, she recognized the tall, lean figure, the drooping mustache, the cold, calculating eyes. Sheriff Daniel Crawford. Emma's blood ran cold. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her expression neutral, even as her mind raced through possibilities. "Caleb," she whispered urgently as she hurried toward the barn. "Someone is coming. It might be the sheriff. You need to hide." Caleb did not ask questions. He was on his feet in an instant, his wounded side making him wince, and climbing the ladder to the hayloft. Within seconds he had disappeared into the shadows among the bales, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Emma walked back out to the yard, smoothing her dress, composing her features into what she hoped was an expression of innocent curiosity. Crawford reined in his horse at the edge of the property and swung down from the saddle. His spurs jingled against the packed earth as he climbed the porch steps. "Morning, Mrs. Thornton," he said, tipping his hat. "Hope I am not interrupting anything." "Not at all, Sheriff. What brings you out this way?" His eyes swept across the property, noting the repaired fences, the new shingles on the barn, the signs of work that one woman alone could not possibly have accomplished. "Just checking on folks after that big storm," he said. His voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Making sure everyone is safe. That is my job, after all." "I appreciate the concern," Emma said carefully. "As you can see, I am managing just fine." "So it seems." Crawford took a step closer, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Heard you might have some help out here, though. Neighbors spotted a man near your property line a few days back. Tall fellow, dark hair." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "People see what they want to see, Sheriff. You know how rumors spread in small towns. I am alone here. I have always been alone." Crawford studied her face for a long moment. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, the wheels turning as he weighed her words against what he suspected. "That may be," he said slowly. "But I am here to give you a warning, Mrs. Thornton. We have received word that the Black Ridge Gang passed through this territory about 2 weeks ago. Hit a stagecoach station over by Willow Creek. Things went bad. We believe one of them was shot and separated from the rest." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They are mean folks, Mrs. Thornton, and they are likely looking for their lost man, or for whoever might have found him." Emma forced herself to meet his eyes without flinching. "What does that have to do with me?" Crawford stepped even closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Just this," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "If a woman out here were to find a wounded man, she might be tempted to help him. She might feel pity. But if that man is an outlaw and she gives him shelter, she becomes an outlaw herself. The law is clear on that point. If you are hiding someone, Mrs. Thornton, you will hang right alongside him." The threat hung in the air between them, naked and undisguised. Emma held his gaze, refusing to look away. "I understand, Sheriff. If I see anything suspicious, I will be sure to let you know." Crawford smiled, but it was a smile that never reached his eyes. He looked at her the way a hungry man looks at a meal he cannot yet afford, full of want and calculation. "You do that," he said. "And remember, a woman like you should not be living out here alone. It is not safe. If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." He touched his hat again and walked back to his horse. Emma watched him ride away until he was nothing but a speck on the horizon, and only then did she let herself breathe. She had lied to the law. She had looked a sheriff in the eye and deceived him, and in doing so she had bound her fate to the man hiding in her hayloft. There was no going back now. As Crawford rode toward town, his mind was not on the road ahead. It was on Emma Thornton. She was hiding something. He was certain of it. The new fences, the repaired barn, the nervousness she could not quite conceal. A woman living alone could not have done all that work by herself. Someone was helping her, and he had a very good idea who that someone might be. But there was more to his interest than just the law. Emma Thornton was a handsome woman even after 2 years of hard living, and she had land. Good land that her dead husband had left behind. Land that a man could build something on if he had a mind to. Crawford had been watching her for a long time now, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to need someone to rescue her. And now, if his suspicions were correct, she had given him exactly the leverage he needed. If she was sheltering an outlaw, she was his. The land, the ranch, everything. She would have no choice but to accept his protection, his proposal, his ownership. All he had to do was prove it. And he would, one way or another. That night, with the fire crackling in the hearth and the wind sighing outside the window, the walls between Emma and Caleb finally began to crumble. It started with Emma. She did not know why she chose that moment to open up. Maybe it was the fear that still lingered from Crawford's visit. Maybe it was the isolation that had been crushing her for so long. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired, so desperately tired of carrying her secrets alone. "William was not my choice," she said quietly, staring into the flames. "I was 18 when we married. My father owed him money, a lot of money, and I was the payment." Caleb sat across from her, his gray eyes fixed on her face. He did not speak, did not interrupt, just listened. "He was 20 years older than me," Emma continued. "A good man in his way. He never raised a hand to me, never drank, never shouted. But there was no love between us. When he touched me, I felt nothing, just duty, just emptiness." She looked up, meeting Caleb's gaze. "When he died, I cried. I cried because the life I knew was over, because I was suddenly alone, because I was terrified of what would happen to me. But I did not cry for him. I did not know what love was." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Not until—" She could not finish the sentence. The words stuck in her throat, too dangerous to speak aloud. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that remained unsaid. Then Caleb spoke. "My father was a blacksmith," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Best man I ever knew. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps, to live an honest life. But I was young and stupid. I wanted adventure, easy money, freedom from the rules that everyone else had to follow." He stared at his hands, the scarred and calloused hands of a man who had used them for violence. "When he died of lung sickness, I was 12 years old. My mother had already run off years before. I was alone in the world with nothing but the clothes on my back and the stupid dreams in my head." "That is when you met Cole Hardin." Caleb nodded. "He seemed like everything I wanted to be. Powerful, respected, free. I did not see what he really was until it was too late. Until I had done things that I can never take back." "What kind of things?" "Robbery mostly, holding up stagecoaches, taking money from people who had done nothing wrong. I told myself it was just business, that nobody got hurt. But that was a lie. People always got hurt. Maybe not physically, but in other ways. We took their money, their peace of mind, their faith in the world." He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw an abyss of guilt and self-loathing. "I have done terrible things, Emma. I have pointed my gun at innocent people. I have taken what did not belong to me. I have stood by while others were hurt. I am not the man you deserve." "But you refused to kill the child," Emma said softly. "Yes, that was my line, the one thing I would not do no matter what Cole threatened." He laughed bitterly. "Too little, too late. One good decision does not erase 100 bad ones." Emma reached across the space between them and took his hand. His skin was rough against hers but warm, alive. "It is never too late," she said. "If it were too late, you would not be here. You would not be fighting so hard to be better." Caleb looked at their joined hands, then at her face. In the firelight his gray eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. "I do not deserve you," he whispered. "Neither of us deserves anything," Emma replied. "We just have to keep trying to be worthy of what we have been given." 3.5 weeks after the night Emma had dragged Caleb out of the storm, another tempest came to the Texas plains. This one had been building all day, the sky darkening from blue to gray to an angry, churning black. By evening the wind was howling around the cabin like a living thing, and lightning danced across the horizon in continuous flickering sheets. Caleb could not sleep. He lay in the hayloft, listening to the storm rage outside, and felt the familiar demons stirring in his chest. They always came on nights like this, when the thunder reminded him of gunshots, and the darkness reminded him of all the things he had done that he could never undo. He climbed down from the loft and slipped outside into the full fury of the storm. The rain hit him like a physical blow, soaking through his clothes in seconds, plastering his hair to his skull. The wind shoved him sideways, and he had to brace himself against it to keep from falling. Lightning split the sky, turning night into day, and thunder crashed so close that he felt it vibrate through his bones. He walked out into the middle of the yard and stood there, letting the storm punish him. It was what he deserved. All of it. The pain, the cold, the violence of nature that mirrored the violence inside his own soul. He did not hear Emma come up behind him until she grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" she shouted over the howling wind. Her nightgown was already soaked through, clinging to her thin frame, her hair streaming water down her face. "Go back inside," he yelled. "This does not concern you. You are on my land, standing in my storm. It concerns me." She pulled at his arm, trying to turn him toward the cabin. He resisted, his body rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. "You should stay away from me," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the thunder. "There are demons inside me, Emma. They do not sleep quietly on nights like this." "I have demons too," she cried, and there was a rawness in her voice that cut through the noise of the storm. "Loneliness. Emptiness. They have been eating me alive for 2 years. They stood face to face in the driving rain, two souls stripped bare by the fury of the elements. Lightning flashed, illuminating their faces in stark frozen moments of light. The water streamed down their cheeks, indistinguishable from tears. "Everything I touch turns to rot and blood," Caleb shouted. "I should have died out by that fence. It would have been a clean end." "And what about me?" Emma screamed back. "Do you think I am not dying too? Do you think living alone out here year after year is not killing me just as surely?" Something cracked in Caleb's expression. A wall coming down, a defense crumbling. "You deserve better than me," he said, his voice breaking. "I deserve to feel alive." Emma grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. "For the first time in my entire life I feel like I am not just existing. I feel like I am living. And it is because of you." The storm raged around them, rain and wind and lightning, but in that moment they were the only two people in the world. "Do not be gentle with me," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes locked on his. "I need you to be rough. I need you to make me feel something real." Those words broke the last of his resistance. His mouth crashed down on hers, a collision of desperation and hunger. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of survival, of two drowning people clinging to each other in a raging sea. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him, and she molded herself to his body, seeking warmth, seeking connection, seeking something that neither of them had words for. They stood there in the pouring rain, locked together beneath the storming sky, sharing a desperate and breathless embrace that was born of nothing but pain and loneliness and the raw, undeniable need to feel something other than empty. When the dawn finally came, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, and a strange, fragile peace had settled over the land. Emma sat by the fire in her cabin, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the embers. Caleb sat across from her, his shirt still damp, his expression unreadable in the gray morning light. Neither of them spoke for a long time. What had happened between them in the storm had changed everything. They both knew it. The walls they had built, the distance they had tried to maintain it, was all gone now. In its place was something new and terrifying, a bond that could not be broken, a love that could not be denied. "I am not going anywhere," Caleb said finally. His voice was quiet but firm. "Whatever happens, whatever comes, I am staying." Emma looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I know," she said, and for the first time in 2 years, she smiled. The days that followed were the happiest Emma had known since long before William's death. She and Caleb worked side by side, rebuilding and repairing, talking and laughing, stealing moments of closeness whenever they could. The ranch that had felt like a prison for so long now felt like a home. The silence that had crushed her was filled with his voice, his presence, his steady strength. They rode out together on the 2 remaining horses, exploring the far reaches of the property. He showed her hidden springs she had never known existed, and she showed him the grove of cottonwood trees where she sometimes went to be alone with her thoughts. At night they sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, and talked about the future. A future that seemed possible now in a way it never had before. But the future has a way of turning dark without warning. In a saloon in a town 30 miles to the east, Garrett Wade was listening. He sat in a shadowy corner, nursing a whiskey. He had no intention of finishing, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He had been searching for Caleb Mercer for 2 weeks now, and he was getting desperate. Cole was not a patient man, and failure was not something the Black Ridge gang tolerated. A farmer at the bar was talking to his friend, his voice just loud enough to carry. "You hear about the Thornton widow," the farmer said. "Word is she has got herself some help out there. Tall fellow, dark hair. Nobody knows where he came from." Garrett's ears pricked up. "Probably just some drifter," the friend replied. "Looking for work." "Maybe, but old Peterson says he saw the man from a distance and he moved like someone who knew how to handle himself, not like a regular farm hand." Garrett set down his glass and stood up. He dropped a few coins on the table and walked out into the night, a smile spreading across his thin face. "Found you, Caleb," he thought. "Found you at last." The attack came without warning. It was a moonless night, the sky black as pitch, when Emma woke to a strange orange glow filtering through her cabin window. For a moment she lay still, confused, wondering if she was dreaming. Then she smelled smoke. She leaped out of bed and ran to the window. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. The east field, the one she had just replanted with seeds for next year's harvest, was on fire. Flames leaped toward the sky, orange and red and hungry, consuming everything in their path. Smoke billowed into the darkness, blotting out the stars. "Caleb!" she screamed, running outside. He was already there, standing in the middle of the yard with his pistol drawn, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flames. And then Emma saw them. 2 riders silhouetted against the firelight, sitting motionless on their horses at the edge of the property. They made no move to attack, no move to flee. They just watched like demons, observing the destruction they had wrought. One of them raised a pistol and fired twice. Not at Emma or Caleb, but at the stable where the 2 horses were sheltered. The screams of the dying animals cut through the night, high and terrible and full of agony. Caleb fired back, but the riders were already gone, wheeling their horses and vanishing into the darkness. Their laughter echoed behind them, cruel and mocking. Emma ran to the stable, her heart pounding, and found a scene of horror. Both horses lay dead on the ground, blood pooling beneath their bodies. And on the wooden wall of the stable, written in that same blood, were 2 words. We are coming." Emma stood frozen, staring at the message, feeling the world she had built collapse around her. They had found them. Cole Hardin and his men had found them, and this was just the beginning. Caleb came up beside her, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "This is my fault," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Everything that has happened is because of me. Caleb, do not. They will keep coming. They will not stop until they have me, or until they have destroyed everything you have." He turned to face her, his gray eyes blazing. "I have to leave. I have to find them before they find us again." "No." Emma grabbed his arm. "You cannot go out there alone against all of them. I do not have a choice." His voice softened and he reached up to touch her face. "If I stay here, they will burn this place to the ground with you inside. But if I go after them, if I take the fight to them, maybe I can end this. You will die." "Maybe." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. "But you will live, and that is all that matters to me now." Emma felt tears streaming down her face, mixing with the ash that drifted through the air. "I love you," she whispered. "Do you understand? I love you, and I cannot lose you." "I know." Caleb pulled her close, holding her tightly. "I love you too, more than I have ever loved anything in my miserable life." They stood there in the glow of the dying flames, two people who had found each other against all odds, now being torn apart by a past that refused to stay buried. Finally Caleb stepped back. "Wait for me," he said. "I will come back, I promise." "You had better," Emma said, her voice breaking, "because love like this does not come twice in a lifetime." He kissed her one last time, a kiss that tasted of tears and smoke and desperate hope. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Emma stood alone in the ruins of her ranch, watching the embers of her field die, and prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. "Please let him come back. Please do not take him from me too." But the only answer was the wind carrying the smell of ashes and the silence of the empty night. 4 days passed. 4 days of waiting, of watching the horizon, of jumping at every sound. Emma did not sleep. She barely ate. She moved through the wreckage of her life like a ghost going through the motions of survival without any real purpose behind them. On the 4th day she could not stand it anymore. She walked to the neighboring ranch and sold her remaining 9 cattle to Henry Dawson. He gave her a horse and a handful of cash in exchange, his greedy eyes shining with satisfaction. Emma did not care. The ranch, the land, the life she had fought so hard to preserve, none of it mattered anymore. Only Caleb mattered. In town she bought a new pistol and a box of ammunition. The shopkeeper looked at her strangely, but did not ask questions. People in this part of the country learned early not to pry into other people's business. She was leaving the store when she overheard 2 men talking. "Heard they found 3 bodies out by Twisted Canyon this morning," one of them said. "Members of the Black Ridge Gang. Shot to pieces, all 3 of them. Cole Hardin, Garrett Wade, and one other. The whole territory is talking about it. One man did that. That is what they are saying, someone very angry or very desperate." Emma's heart stopped. 3 dead outlaws. Caleb had done what he set out to do. He had hunted them down and killed them. But was he still alive? She did not waste another second. She ran to her horse, mounted up, and rode toward Twisted Canyon as fast as the animal could carry her. The canyon was a jagged wound in the earth, a place of shadows and dark omens. Emma arrived in the late afternoon and found fresh signs of a recent posse hoofprints and boot marks in the soft earth. Sheriff Crawford and his men had been here collecting the bodies, but they were gone now. Emma searched for hours, combing through every crevice and shadow, calling Caleb's name until her voice went hoarse. The sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and gold. And then she found him. He lay in a small rocky alcove, almost completely hidden from view. His face was pale as death, his lips tinged with blue, and a new wound in his side had soaked his shirt through with blood. He had torn his stitches open. He was barely breathing. "Caleb?" Emma fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "Oh God, Caleb, please." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. "Emma," he whispered, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. "You should not be here. Do not talk," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Save your strength. I am going to get you out of here." But even as she spoke the words, she heard the sound she had been dreading. Hoofbeats, coming fast. She looked up and saw them cresting the ridge above. Sheriff Crawford and 2 deputies, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. Crawford smiled when he saw her. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying down into the canyon. "I knew you were hiding something, Mrs. Thornton. I knew it all along." The deputies descended into the canyon, their guns drawn. Emma tried to shield Caleb with her body, but it was useless. They pulled her aside, shoved Caleb's barely conscious form onto the back of a horse, and bound his hands with rough rope. "Caleb Mercer," Crawford announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You are under arrest for robbery and murder, and you, Mrs. Thornton, are guilty of harboring a fugitive." "He is innocent," Emma screamed. "He saved my life. He protected me." "The law does not care about your feelings," Crawford said coldly. "He will hang by the end of the week. And as for you—" He paused, looking at her with those cold, calculating eyes. "I think we can come to an arrangement, one that benefits us both." Emma looked at the man who held her fate in his hands, and she understood exactly what he was offering. Her freedom in exchange for her submission. Her life in exchange for becoming his property. She would rather die. But she said nothing. She let them take her back to town, let them lock Caleb in a cell, let them think they had won. Because in her mind a plan was already forming. They thought they had beaten her. They thought she was just a weak woman with no options left. They were wrong. She was going to save him, no matter what it took, no matter what it cost. She was going to save the man she loved, or she was going to die trying. The night before the hanging, Emma went to see him one last time. The jail was cold and dark, and it smelled of sweat and despair. The young deputy on duty let her in with a look of pity on his face. "5 minutes," he said. "That is all I can give you." Emma walked to the cell at the end of the corridor. Caleb sat on the narrow cot, his back against the stone wall, his hands hanging between his knees. When he looked up and saw her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of love and anguish. "You should not be here," he said. "There is nowhere else I would be." She knelt before the bars, reaching through to take his hands. His skin was cold, but his grip was strong. "They are going to kill me tomorrow," he said, "and there is nothing either of us can do to stop it." "You do not know that. Emma, please." His voice cracked. "Do not give me hope when there is none. It is easier this way. Cleaner." She leaned closer, her lips almost touching the cold iron bars. "Tomorrow," she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "When they bring you to the gallows, do not be afraid. Trust me." His eyes widened. "What are you planning?" "Just trust me. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had saved his life and taught him to live again. This woman who had given him something he had never expected to find. "I trust you," he said, "with everything I am." Emma stood up, still holding his hands through the bars. "I love you, Caleb Mercer, and I will not let them take you from me." The deputy called out that her time was up. Emma released Caleb's hands and walked toward the door. At the threshold she turned back one last time. "Tomorrow," she said. "Remember, trust me." And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the darkness with nothing but her words and a fragile, impossible hope. Outside the sky was dark and heavy with clouds. Another storm was coming, and this time Emma intended to ride it all the way to the end. The morning of the execution arrived wrapped in darkness. Emma had not slept. She had spent the entire night preparing, checking, and rechecking every detail of the plan that had taken shape in her mind over the past 48 hours. A plan that was equal parts desperate and insane. A plan that would either save the man she loved or get them both killed. She dressed before dawn in practical clothes, a worn cotton shirt, sturdy trousers that had belonged to William, and her old leather boots. She braided her hair and tucked it under a wide-brimmed hat that would shadow her face. Over everything she wore a long coat that concealed the Colt pistol holstered at her hip. The ranch was empty now. The cattle were gone, sold to Henry Dawson for a fraction of what they were worth. The horses were dead, killed by Cole Hardin's men in their raid. The fields were burned. The dreams were ashes. Emma did not look back as she walked away from the cabin where she had spent the loneliest years of her life. There was nothing left for her here. Everything she cared about was in a jail cell in town, waiting to die. She had bought a new horse with the money from Dawson, a strong bay gelding that could run fast and far if needed. She mounted up and rode toward Dusty Creek as the first gray light of dawn began to seep over the eastern horizon. The sky above her was the color of a bruise, dark and swollen with the promise of rain. Another storm was building in the west. She could feel it in the air, could smell it on the wind. By afternoon, it would break. Good, she thought. The storm would be her ally. She reached the outskirts of town just as the sun cleared the horizon, though the thick clouds made it hard to tell exactly where the sun was. The streets were already filling with people, townsfolk, drawn by the morbid spectacle of a public hanging. They gathered in clusters, talking in low voices, their faces a mixture of excitement and unease. Emma tied her horse behind the blacksmith shop in a spot where it could not be seen from the main square, but where she could reach it quickly. She checked her pistol one more time, making sure it was loaded, making sure the mechanism worked smoothly. Then she made her way through the crowd, keeping her head down, moving toward a position that gave her a clear line of sight to the gallows. The wooden platform stood in the center of the square, freshly built for the occasion. The raw new lumber looked obscene against the gray sky, like a wound that had not yet begun to heal. 13 steps led up to the platform, and at the top a crossbeam supported the heavy rope that would end Caleb Mercer's life. Sheriff Crawford stood at the base of the gallows, conferring with his deputies. He looked pleased with himself, Emma noticed, satisfied, like a man who had finally gotten everything he wanted. She wondered if he would still look so satisfied when her bullet cut the rope. In his office at the jail, Crawford was savoring his victory. He stood by the window looking out at the gallows being prepared and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Everything was falling into place. Caleb Mercer would hang, the Black Ridge Gang would be dealt a serious blow, and Crawford would be hailed as the man who brought justice to the territory. But that was only part of his plan. The real prize was Emma Thornton. He had seen the way she looked at the outlaw, had recognized the love in her eyes when she came to visit him in his cell. That love was a weapon he could use. With Mercer dead, Emma would be alone, vulnerable, desperate. She would need protection, need someone to take care of her, and Crawford intended to be that someone. The land would be his. The woman would be his. Everything that William Thornton had built would pass into his hands, and no one would be able to stop him. He straightened his collar and walked out to supervise the execution. Today was going to be a very good day. They brought Caleb out just after 9 o'clock. He walked with his head held high, his hands bound in front of him, his gray eyes sweeping across the crowd. Despite the bruises on his face and the pallor of his skin, there was no fear in his expression. Only a quiet dignity that made several people in the crowd look away, unable to meet his gaze. Emma watched from her position near the blacksmith shop. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands were steady. She had one chance at this, one shot. If she missed, they would both die. But she would not miss. Caleb had taught her well. The deputies marched him up the 13 steps to the platform. The crowd fell silent, a hush of anticipation spreading through the square like ripples in still water. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Crawford climbed up after them, a piece of paper in his hand. He cleared his throat and began to read. Caleb Mercer, for the crimes of robbery and murder, for riding with the notorious Black Ridge Gang, for terrorizing the good citizens of this territory, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. Do you have any last words? Caleb looked out at the crowd, and for a moment Emma thought he might remain silent. Then his eyes found hers across the distance, and she saw a flicker of something in them. Recognition, trust, love. He turned back to Crawford and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the silent square. "She taught me to live clean," he said. "I would die for her." A murmur ran through the crowd. People exchanged confused glances, wondering who he was talking about, what he meant. Emma knew. She knew, and the words gave her strength. Crawford shrugged, unimpressed by the declaration. He nodded to the hangman, who stepped forward with a black hood. "Any last requests?" "Just one," Caleb said. "Get on with it." The hangman pulled the hood over Caleb's head, plunging him into darkness. Then he settled the thick, coarse rope around his neck, adjusting it until the knot rested just behind his left ear. Emma raised her pistol. The world seemed to slow down around her. She could see every detail with crystalline clarity: the grain of the wooden platform, the frayed edges of the rope, the slight tremor in the hangman's hands as he reached for the lever. Crawford raised his arm. "Proceed," he commanded. The hangman pulled the lever. Emma fired. The gunshot split the morning like a crack of thunder, sharp and sudden and impossibly loud. The bullet flew true, striking the rope exactly where she had aimed, just a few inches above Caleb's head. The rope exploded in a spray of severed fibers. It fell away useless and harmless, leaving Caleb standing on the platform with nothing around his neck but empty air. For a single frozen moment, nobody moved. The crowd stood paralyzed with shock, their mouths hanging open, their eyes wide. Crawford stared at the severed rope, as if he could not comprehend what he was seeing. The hangman stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. Then chaos erupted. Caleb tore the hood from his head, his gray eyes blazing as they found Emma across the square. She was already running, already shoving her way through the panicked crowd toward the blacksmith shop where she had hidden the horse. "Run!" she screamed. "Now!" Caleb did not hesitate. He jumped from the edge of the platform, his bound hands making the landing awkward. He hit the ground hard, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as his wounded side absorbed some of the impact, but he was on his feet immediately, running toward her voice, dodging through the scattering crowd. Crawford's voice cut through the pandemonium. "Stop them, shoot them, do not let them escape." Gunshots cracked through the air, but the crowd was too thick, too chaotic. The deputies could not get a clear shot without risking hitting innocent bystanders. Emma reached the horse first. She had already untied the reins, already had one foot in the stirrup when Caleb reached her. She grabbed his bound hands and hauled him up behind her, feeling his arms wrap around her waist. "Hold on!" she shouted, and kicked the horse into a gallop. The animal lunged forward, its hooves thundering against the packed earth of the street. They plowed through the last of the panicked crowd and burst out of the town gates, leaving screams and gunfire behind them. The open prairie stretched ahead of them, a sea of brown grass under a darkening sky, and behind them, already forming a posse of armed men on horseback. The chase had begun. They rode hard across the open plain, pushing the horse to its limits. Emma could hear the hoofbeats of their pursuers growing closer with each passing minute. The bay gelding was strong, but it was carrying 2 riders, and the posse behind them had fresh horses and righteous anger on their side. "We need to reach the river," she shouted over the wind. "If we can cross, they will lose our trail." Caleb's arms tightened around her waist. "The Brazos. It is 2 miles from here." "Then we had better ride faster." The sky above them had turned from bruised purple to an angry, churning black. The storm that had been building all morning was finally ready to unleash its fury. The wind picked up, whipping Emma's hair around her face, carrying with it the sharp metallic smell of rain. The first drops hit them like thrown pebbles, cold and hard and full of menace. Within seconds, those drops became a deluge, a solid wall of water that crashed down from the heavens and turned the world into a blur of gray and shadow. Emma welcomed it. The rain would make it harder for the posse to see them, harder to aim, harder to follow. It was nature itself coming to their aid. But nature was a double-edged sword. The Brazos River came into view through the curtain of rain, and Emma's heart sank. It was not the gentle, fordable stream she remembered from better days. The storm had transformed it into a monster, a churning brown torrent that had swallowed its banks and was still rising. Debris swirled in the current, branches and logs and dead animals carried along by a force that cared nothing for human plans or human hopes. "We cannot cross that," Caleb shouted. But behind them, the posse was closing in. Emma could see them now, dark shapes emerging from the rain, their shouts barely audible above the roar of the storm. They had maybe a minute before the first riders reached them. There was no choice. "We have to try," Emma screamed. "Hold your breath." She drove her heels into the horse's flanks, and the animal plunged into the raging water. The cold hit Emma like a physical blow so intense that it drove the air from her lungs. The current grabbed at them immediately, trying to tear them from the saddle, trying to drag them under. The horse fought valiantly, its legs churning against the force of the flood, but it was like trying to swim through an avalanche. They made it halfway across before disaster struck. A massive log carried by the current like a battering ram slammed into the horse's side. The animal screamed a sound of pure terror and pain, and then it was going down its legs, giving way, its body rolling in the churning water. Emma felt Caleb's arms torn from her waist. She felt herself falling, the world-spinning water rushing into her mouth and nose. She tried to scream his name, but the river swallowed the sound. Then there was only darkness and cold, and the terrible crushing weight of the flood. Emma did not know how long she was under. It might have been seconds. It might have been hours. Time lost all meaning in that churning darkness, where up and down were indistinguishable, and every breath was a lungful of muddy water. She fought, even when her muscles screamed for rest, even when the cold sapped the last of her strength. She fought. Her hands clawed at the water, her legs kicked against the current. She was not ready to die, not yet, not when she had come so far. Something grabbed her arm. She thought at first it was a branch debris carried by the flood, but then she felt fingers, human fingers wrapping around her wrist with desperate strength. She was being pulled, hauled through the water by a force that was not the river. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, sucking in air that was half rain and half spray, but still air, still life, still hope. Caleb's face swam into view, pale and wild-eyed and streaming with water. He had somehow managed to cut his bonds against a rock, and now he was dragging her toward the far bank, fighting the current with every ounce of strength he had left. They crawled onto the muddy shore, coughing and retching, more dead than alive. The rain continued to pound down on them, but they were out of the river. They had made it. Emma lay on her back in the mud, staring up at the weeping sky, and laughed. It was a sound that was half sob and half hysteria, but it was also genuine, because against all odds they were still alive. Caleb collapsed beside her, his chest heaving. "The horse," Emma gasped. "Gone. Swept away." He turned his head to look at her, water dripping from his dark hair. "But they will not follow us across that, not in this storm." He was right. The river had become an impassable barrier, a wall of churning water that would claim any rider foolish enough to attempt the crossing. The posse would have to find another way across, and by then Emma and Caleb would be long gone, if they could keep moving. "Come on," Caleb said, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. He reached down and helped Emma up. "We need to find shelter before this storm gets any worse." She looked at him, at this man who had just pulled her from a raging flood, who had nearly died a dozen times in the past hour, who still had blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his side. "I love you," she said. He smiled, a real smile that lit up his pale, exhausted face. "I know," he said. "Now let us find somewhere dry before we both freeze to death." They walked through the storm for what felt like hours. The rain showed no sign of letting up, and the wind had grown teeth, cutting through their soaked clothes with vicious efficiency. Emma could not feel her fingers anymore, could barely feel her feet. Every step was an act of will, a conscious decision to keep moving when every instinct screamed to lie down and rest. Caleb walked beside her, one arm around her shoulders, lending her what strength he had left. His face was gray with exhaustion and pain, and his breathing came in short, ragged gasps that worried her. The wound in his side needed attention, needed medicine and clean bandages and rest. But there was nothing she could do for him out here, nothing but keep walking and pray. It was Caleb who saw it first. "There," he said, pointing through the curtain of rain. "On that hill." Emma squinted, trying to see what he was looking at. And then as lightning flashed across the sky, she saw it too. A building, small and dark and clearly abandoned, but a building nonetheless. A shelter from the storm. They stumbled up the hill, their boots sliding in the mud, supporting each other with the last reserves of their strength. As they drew closer, Emma could make out more details. Stone walls covered in moss and ivy. A doorway with no door. A roof that had collapsed long ago, leaving the interior open to the sky. It was a church. An old Spanish mission, from the looks of it, abandoned for decades, maybe longer. The walls still stood solid and strong despite the years of neglect. Inside, protected from the worst of the wind, a large wooden cross lay against the far wall, fallen from its original position, but still intact. They practically fell through the doorway, their legs giving out at last. Emma sank to the floor, her back against the cold stone wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. Caleb collapsed beside her, and for a long moment they just sat there, too exhausted to move, too grateful to speak. The storm raged on outside, thunder rolling across the sky like the footsteps of giants, but inside the ruined church they were safe, sheltered, alive. "We made it," Emma whispered. Caleb turned his head to look at her, in the dim light filtering through the holes in the roof. His gray eyes were soft in a way she had never seen before. "You saved my life," he said. "You risked everything for me. Your ranch, your freedom, your life. Everything." "I would do it again," she said. 100 times, 1,000. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I have done terrible things," he said quietly. "Things that I can never make right no matter how long I live. But when I am with you, I feel like maybe there is still something good in me, something worth saving." Emma covered his hand with her own, pressing it against her cheek. "There is," she said. "There always was. You just needed someone to help you see it." "I love you, Emma Thornton. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone. And I swear to you here in this place before God and whatever angels might be listening that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you have given me." Tears streamed down Emma's face, mixing with the rainwater that still dripped from her hair. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I do not need you to be worthy. I just need you to be mine." He leaned forward and kissed her, a slow and tender kiss that tasted of rain and tears and the beginning of something new. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the ruined church, 2 broken souls had found each other at last. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb looked up at the fallen cross leaning against the wall. "This is a church," he said. "Or it was once. Maybe it still is in some way that matters. What are you thinking?" He turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw a question that he was almost afraid to ask. "Marry me," he said. "Right here, right now. No priest, no witnesses, no papers. Just us and God and the promise we make to each other." Emma looked at him, at this man who had come into her life like a bolt of lightning and changed everything. She thought about all the reasons she should say no. He was an outlaw, a fugitive, a man with a price on his head. They had nothing, not a cent to their names, nowhere to go, no plan for the future. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the way she felt when he looked at her, the way her heart beat faster when he was near, the way the world seemed to make sense for the first time in her life when she was in his arms. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They knelt together before the fallen cross, their hands clasped between them. The rain drummed on the broken roof above them, and lightning illuminated the ancient stones in brief flickering flashes. "I, Caleb Mercer, take you, Emma Thornton, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. "I promise to love you, protect you, and honor you for as long as I live. I promise to be the man you deserve, to work for our future, to never give you reason to regret this moment. This is my vow, made before God and sealed with my heart." Emma squeezed his hands, her own voice barely above a whisper. "I, Emma Thornton, take you, Caleb Mercer, to be my husband. I promise to love you, support you, and stand beside you through whatever storms may come. I promise to believe in you, even when you do not believe in yourself, to be your partner and your home for as long as we both shall live. This is my vow, made before God and sealed with my soul." They kissed again, sealing their promises, and outside the ruined church the storm began to fade. By morning the world had been transformed. Emma woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the gaps in the church's broken roof. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a landscape that sparkled with moisture, every blade of grass and every stone glistening like jewels in the early light. Caleb lay beside her, his arms still wrapped around her, his face peaceful in sleep. The lines of pain and worry that usually marked his features had smoothed away, leaving him looking younger, almost boyish. She watched him for a long moment, this man who was now her husband in every way that mattered. They had nothing, no money, no horses, no supplies. They were still fugitives, still hunted, still in danger. But they had each other. And right now, in this moment, that was enough. Caleb stirred and opened his eyes, those pale gray eyes that had haunted her dreams since the first night she had seen them. "Good morning, wife," he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good morning, husband," she replied, and the words felt right in a way she had not expected. Natural, true. He sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded side. The bandage was soaked through with blood and needed to be changed, but there was nothing she could do about it here. "We need to keep moving," he said, reading her thoughts. "The posse will have found a way across the river by now. They will be searching for us." Emma nodded. "Where do we go?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring out through the doorway of the church at the vast empty landscape beyond. "West," he said finally. "New Mexico territory. It is far from here, far from anyone who knows my face or my name. We can start fresh there. Build a new life. With what? We have nothing." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen before. Hope. "We have each other," he said. "We have 2 good hands each, and the willingness to work. That is more than many people start with. We will find a way, Emma. I know we will." She reached out and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. They left the ruined church as the sun climbed higher in the sky, walking west toward an uncertain future, but walking together hand in hand, husband and wife. 6 months later, in a small town called Las Cruces in the New Mexico territory, a couple was making a home. The man was known locally as Jack Morrison. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and pale gray eyes that seemed to see right through you. He worked as a leather craftsman, a trade he had learned from an old Mexican saddle maker who had taken him on as an apprentice. His work was good, honest work, and people had begun to seek him out for custom pieces. The woman was known as his wife, Sarah Morrison. She had fair hair that had been lightened further by the strong southwestern sun and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She tended a small vegetable garden behind their modest adobe house and had a reputation for her skill with a rifle, a reputation that kept troublemakers at a respectful distance. No one in Las Cruces knew their real names. They had heard through travelers that Sheriff Crawford had been dismissed from his position after letting 2 prisoners escape, and that the Thornton Ranch had finally been claimed by the desert. No one knew that Jack Morrison had once ridden with the Black Ridge Gang, or that Sarah Morrison had shot a rope in half from 50 feet to save him from the gallows. Those were secrets that belonged to a different life, a life they had left behind on the other side of the Rio Grande. Their ranch was small, nothing like the spread Emma had once tried to maintain in Texas. Just a few acres of land, a simple house, a barn for the horses, and a small herd of cattle that Caleb, she still thought of him as Caleb, even if she called him Jack in public, had bought with the first money he earned from his leather work. It was not much, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, paid for with their own sweat. On a warm spring evening, Emma stood on the porch of their little house, watching the sun sink toward the distant mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, a daily miracle that never failed to take her breath away. Caleb came riding up from the direction of town, his saddlebags bulging with supplies. He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, then climbed the porch steps and kissed her on the cheek. "Good day?" she asked. "Mr. Peterson ordered another saddle. Said mine was the best work he had seen in 20 years. He smiled that rare, genuine smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "I think we might actually be making a go of this." Emma smiled back, but there was something in her expression that made him pause. "What is it?" he asked. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head, her smile growing wider. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "Everything is exactly right. I was just waiting for the right moment to tell you something." "Tell me what?" Emma took his hand and placed it on her stomach on the gentle swell that had begun to show beneath her dress. "We are going to have a baby," she said. Caleb stared at her, his gray eyes going wide, his mouth falling open. For a long moment he did not speak, could not speak. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure, unrestrained joy. "A baby," he said, setting her down, but keeping his arms around her. "We are going to be parents." "I know," Emma said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I still cannot quite believe it myself." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining with tears that he did not try to hide. "I never thought I would have this," he said quietly. "A home, a family, a future. I thought I was going to die alone in a ditch somewhere, and that was probably what I deserved." He cupped her face in his hands. "You gave me all of this. You saved me, Emma. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," she said. "That is what love is supposed to do." They stood there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the last light of day fade over their little piece of land. The mountains turned purple in the distance, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever miss it?" Caleb asked. "Texas. Your old life." Emma thought about it for a moment. She thought about the ranch she had fought so hard to keep the loneliness that had nearly destroyed her, the husband she had never loved. "I miss some things," she admitted. "The cottonwood trees in the fall, the way the sky looked before a summer storm. But I do not miss the life I had there. That woman was already dead, Caleb. She was just going through the motions, waiting for the rest of her body to catch up." She looked up at him, her eyes bright in the fading light. "You brought me back to life. You gave me something to fight for, something to believe in. I would go through all of it again, every terrible moment, if it meant ending up right here with you." Caleb held her tighter. "I love you," he said, "more than words can say." "I know," she replied. "I love you too." The stars came out one by one, sprinkling the velvet sky with points of silver light. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and another answered it. Emma and Caleb stood on the porch of their little adobe house, looking out at the land that was now their home, thinking about the child that would soon join them, and feeling for the first time in either of their lives completely and utterly at peace. 1 year later, on a spring morning, very much like the one when Emma had told Caleb about the baby, she stood once again on the porch watching the sunrise. But now she was not alone. In her arms, wrapped in a soft cotton blanket, was a baby girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They had named her Rose, for the wild roses that grew along the creek behind their property, and she was without question the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. Caleb came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Emma and kissed the top of Rose's head, earning a gurgling laugh from the baby. "She has your smile," Emma said, "and your temper." Caleb replied, grinning. "She screamed for an hour last night until I finally figured out she wanted her blanket folded the other way." "A woman who knows what she wants. Nothing wrong with that." They sat together on the porch steps, watching the day begin. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the pasture. The horses were moving around in their corral. Everything was quiet and still and good. "I was thinking," Caleb said, "about expanding the leather shop. Taking on an apprentice, maybe. There is more work than I can handle alone." "Sounds like a good idea." "And I thought maybe in a few years, when Rose is old enough, we could buy more land, build a proper ranch." something we could pass down to her and to any other children we might have. Emma looked at him, at this man who had once been an outlaw and was now talking about building a legacy for his daughter. "You have come a long way," she said softly. "We have come a long way," he corrected. "Together." Rose made a happy sound and reached up toward her father's face. Caleb took her tiny hand in his, marveling, as he always did, at how small and perfect her fingers were. "You know," he said, "I used to think my life was over. I thought I had made too many mistakes, done too many bad things to ever have a chance at happiness. But then I met you, and everything changed." He turned to look at Emma, his gray eyes full of love. "You taught me that it is never too late to start over, that the past does not have to define the future, that even a man like me could find redemption if he was willing to fight for it." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you taught me that love is worth fighting for," she said, "that it is worth risking everything, worth burning down the whole world if you have to. Because without love, without someone to share your life with, what is the point of living at all?" They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the warmth of the new day on their faces. "No more storms today," Caleb observed, looking at the clear blue sky. Emma smiled. "No," she agreed. "No more storms." But they both knew that was not entirely true. Life was full of storms, big and small, and more would come in time. There would be hardships and setbacks, arguments and tears, moments when they wondered if they had made the right choices. But that was okay. That was what life was. And as long as they faced those storms together, as long as they held on to each other the way they had that night in the flooded river, they would survive. They always would. Because love, like a storm, could destroy everything in its path, but it could also wash away the old and make room for the new. It could tear down walls and break chains and set hearts free. And sometimes, just sometimes, it could take two broken people and make them whole again. Emma looked down at the baby in her arms, then up at the man beside her, her husband, her partner, her home. "I love you." She said the words she had said 1,000 times before and would say 1,000 times again. "I love you too," he replied. And in that moment, with the sun shining down and the world spread out before them full of possibility, they knew that whatever the future might bring, they would face it together, because that was what they had promised each other in a ruined church in the middle of a storm, and it was a promise they intended to keep forever. This is where our story ends. Or perhaps more accurately, this is where their story truly begins. Because the ending of one chapter is always the beginning of another, and the life that Emma and Caleb built in that little town in New Mexico was just the first page of a much longer book. They would face more challenges in the years to come, more storms, both literal and metaphorical. There would be droughts and floods, births and deaths, moments of joy so intense it hurt, and moments of sorrow that seemed like they would never end. But through it all, they would hold on to each other. Through it all, they would remember what they had learned in those desperate weeks when the Black Ridge Gang was hunting them and the law was closing in. That love is not just a feeling, it is a choice. A decision you make every single day to put someone else's happiness alongside your own, to fight for them, even when it would be easier to walk away, to believe in them, even when they do not believe in themselves. Emma had made that choice when she dragged a wounded stranger out of a storm. Caleb had made it when he refused to kill an innocent child, and they had both made it again when they jumped into a raging river, not knowing if they would survive, knowing only that they would rather die together than live apart. Sometimes that is what love requires of us, the willingness to risk everything, to burn down our old lives and walk through the ashes to emerge on the other side, changed but not destroyed. And if we are lucky, if we are very lucky, we find someone who is willing to make that journey with us. Someone who sees our scars and our mistakes and our broken pieces and loves us not in spite of them, but because of them. Someone who teaches us that we are worthy of love even when we have forgotten how to believe it ourselves. Emma Thornton found that person in a wounded outlaw who stumbled onto her ranch in the middle of a storm. Caleb Mercer found it in a stubborn widow who refused to let him die. And together they built a life that neither of them could have imagined alone. That is the power of love. That is the miracle of second chances, and that is why their story is worth telling. So the next time the storms come, and they will come, remember Caleb and Emma. Remember that the darkness always passes. Remember that the sun always rises. And remember that you are never too broken, never too lost, never too far gone to find your way back to the light. All you need is the courage to try. And maybe, just maybe, someone to help you along the way. Because when the storm breaks, that is when you find out what you are truly made of. And that is when love proves what it can do.